Can success ever truly compensate for loneliness? Dive into this story and find out. But before we begin, make a promise to yourself. Never forget that the true worth of life lies not in achievements, but in the people we choose. If this powerful story touches your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of our next inspiring stories. A Calculated Distance. Ethan Kincaid had always believed he was the kind of man who could successfully detach his heart from his ambition. From the day he founded his first venture capital firm in the heart of San Francisco, he had structured his life around discipline, calculated decisions, and the conviction that nothing should matter more than the bottom line. He wore the same style of dark, custom-tailored suit every day, a shade that made his cool blue eyes stand out, and surrounded himself with people who admired his precision and feared his judgment. When he married Victoria, some of his peers were surprised. She was everything he was not: warm, optimistic, and far too willing to see the good in people. She was beautiful. Her blonde hair shimmered in any light, and for a brief period, he almost convinced himself that her sweetness wouldn't be a liability. But as the years passed, the chasm between them widened, a gulf neither knew how to cross. Victoria tried, repeatedly, to remind him that they were supposed to be building a life together, rather than existing as two strangers who shared the same expensive address. She would leave small, loving notes in his briefcase, messages telling him she loved him or missed him, but he rarely saw them. When she pleaded with him to have dinner at home, instead of taking every meal at the office or in a sterile high-end restaurant, he promised he would. But somehow, he never did. She told herself it was just the pressure of his career, that things would get better once the next big acquisition was finalized. But deep in her heart, she knew he was choosing to keep her at arm's length, because it was simply easier for him not to care too much. It was on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that everything shattered. She had been waiting for him in the living room, her hands clasped in her lap, the soft yellow light catching her hair. She had cried heavily before he arrived home, but she'd wiped her face clean, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't want to sound hysterical. She just needed him to listen. He placed his phone down with the practiced impatience of a man who assumed every conversation was a distraction from something more important. Before he could speak, she said his name, and something in her voice made him stop. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt," she whispered. He didn't reply. She looked at him, searching for a glimpse of the man she had married, but all she saw was exhaustion and indifference. She told him she felt like she was disappearing, that she couldn't remember the last time he had asked her what she needed. Her voice broke as she told him she loved him, but no longer knew how to live like this. He remained silent for so long that she thought he might actually turn and walk out without a word. Instead, he released a slow sigh toward her empty expression and said, "I can't do this anymore either. I need a different life." Her throat seized up, and she pressed a hand against her chest, as if she could keep her heart from breaking into pieces. "A different life?" she repeated. He answered her as though they were discussing a quarterly budget, rather than the end of everything that had ever mattered to her. "I'm sorry," he said, though he didn't sound it. "I just can't keep pretending this marriage works." The rest was a blur. He walked out of the house without looking back, and she remained on the edge of the sofa, too stunned to cry. She didn't know then that the moment he closed the door, he had sealed off the one chapter of his life he could never reopen. She didn't know she already carried a part of him that he would spend years wishing he had known. Audience interaction. What would you do if life handed you a second name? Tell us in the comments if you've ever felt undervalued and how you reacted. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part. The quiet resolve. Victoria didn't leave immediately, because for several days she couldn't convince herself it was truly over. She woke up each morning half expecting to hear his familiar footsteps outside the bedroom door or the muffled sound of his voice on a business call. As the hours passed in silence, the truth began to settle into her bones like something cold and heavy. She moved through the rooms of their home like an overstayed guest, touching the back of the chair where he always draped his jacket, sliding her fingers across the smooth kitchen counter where he used to leave his briefcase, feeling smaller each time she realized he would never return. The bed felt too large. The silence was unbearable. She tried to fill it with music and calls to the few friends she still trusted, but nothing could disguise the fact that she was utterly alone. She thought she would feel rage, but mostly she felt empty. It was as if all the years of trying to hold them together had drained her of the strength to properly hate him. She wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for why he had chosen another life. But the memory of their last conversation replayed in her mind, over and over. The hollow tone of his voice when he said he needed a different life was worse than any shout. It had sounded so certain, so resolved, that there was no hope left to fight for. She began to understand that nothing she could have said would have made him stay. When she realized she was late, that her body was telling her something she hadn't dared to imagine, she sat on the bathroom floor with her hand resting on her belly, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. For a long time, she just stayed there, looking at the test in her hand, letting the tears fall silently. It was almost cruel how quickly that knowledge changed everything. She was no longer just a woman who had been abandoned. Now she was a mother, whether he returned or not. The idea terrified her, but it also gave her a small glimpse of purpose in the darkness. She knew she couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by ghosts of a life she had already lost. She began to pack slowly, methodically, folding her clothes with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She took only what she needed, leaving behind the things that had been part of their shared history. The framed photos on the mantelpiece, the wedding china, the pressed flower he had given her once in the early days when he still knew how to be tender. When she zipped her suitcase shut, she felt as though she had shed a skin she could never wear again. She moved to a small town in Oregon, 2 hours away, where no one knew her last name. The landlord didn't ask why she needed the place immediately, or why her voice shook as she handed him the deposit. The apartment was tiny, just a living room and a bedroom, but it was clean and quiet, and it was hers. She lay awake on the first night, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the old pipes, and realized she was more afraid than ever. But she also felt something close to relief, because at least here, she wouldn't have to pretend. As her stomach began to swell beneath her clothes, she would cup it with her arms every morning before getting out of bed, reminding herself that she wasn't truly alone. At her first doctor's appointment, she sat in the waiting room, hands tightly clasped in her lap, wondering if she would ever feel strong enough to do this alone. But when she heard the heartbeat, fast and steady, she closed her eyes and let out a sob. It was the first sound she had made in weeks that wasn't just pain. She found work at a small local bookstore that didn't mind she was pregnant. The owner, a woman named Helen with a kind smile and tired eyes, let her sit behind the counter when her feet started to ache. Victoria learned to sort deliveries and stack displays, grateful for something to occupy her mind. At night, she would lie down with her hand on the curve of her stomach, whispering promises to the baby she carried. She promised she would never leave her. She promised she would try, every day, to be enough for both of them. She knew she couldn't change what Ethan had done. She couldn't undo the choice he had made to leave her. But she could choose something different for herself and her daughter. And in the quiet of that tiny apartment, she decided that survival would be the first thing she taught her daughter. The following months were measured in small, private milestones that no one else saw. Victoria counted them carefully. The first time she felt the baby kick inside her, like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved. The day she found a second-hand crib someone had left by the dumpster and spent hours cleaning it. The moment she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her cheeks had hollowed, her hair fell in a lifeless braid over her shoulder, and her eyes were tired in a way deeper than lack of sleep. But there was also something firmer in her expression, a quiet determination she hadn't known she possessed until there was no other option. She stopped following the news about Ethan, though sometimes his name found her by accident. Once, standing in the supermarket line, she glanced at a glossy magazine near the checkout and saw his face staring back at her. He looked the same as ever, impeccable in his dark suit, a practiced smile on his lips. The headline called him a visionary. She flipped the magazine face down and placed her groceries on the conveyor belt, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the bread. The cashier asked if she was okay, and Victoria nodded, not meeting her eyes. She walked home with her grocery bag clutched to her chest, repeating silently that it didn't matter anymore, that he didn't matter. But that night, after putting away the groceries and sitting on the edge of her bed, she allowed herself the truth she never spoke aloud. A part of her still missed the idea of him, the man she had loved before he decided he needed a different life. Audience interaction. What do you feel when you see what you've lost? In Victoria's place, how would you have overcome the feeling of loss and loneliness? Share your thoughts in the comments. Click like if you believe Victoria made the right choice for her baby. The eyes that Yao knew. When her daughter finally arrived in the early hours of a cold autumn morning, Victoria felt a fear so large it almost crushed her. She was alone in the small delivery room, gripping the bed rails as the nurses moved swiftly around her. She had never imagined bringing a child into the world without a hand to hold. But when the last push came, and she heard a sharp, indignant cry, something inside her broke wide open. The nurse placed the baby on her chest, and Victoria looked down at a tiny, perfect face, framed by dark hair that already reminded her of someone she wasn't ready to forgive. The baby blinked open her clear blue eyes, and all the loneliness of the past year dissolved in an instant. She named her Olivia. In those first few days at home, Victoria felt like she was learning to breathe again. Every routine, feeding, rocking, changing tiny diapers, was clumsy at first. She cried as often as the baby did. But when Olivia wrapped a small hand around her finger, Victoria discovered there was still room inside her heart for a pure love, untainted by disappointment. Money was tight in a way that sometimes kept her awake at night. The bookstore job ended when she couldn't manage standing behind a counter with a newborn strapped to her chest. She found work cleaning offices after hours, carrying Olivia in her sling, stopping every few minutes to check that she was still sleeping. Some nights, she got home so tired she thought her legs would give out on the stairs. But even when her body ached and her mind was fuzzy with worry, she never wished she had chosen differently. Olivia was the only part of her life that she felt had never been a mistake. When Olivia was old enough to laugh, to grab her hair and babble nonsense, Victoria began to feel the first fragile pieces of herself coming back together. She learned to stop imagining what it would have been like if Ethan had stayed. She stopped picturing him in the delivery room or next to her at the kitchen table. Instead, she focused on every ordinary miracle, the weight of her daughter sleeping on her chest, the softness of her hair beneath Victoria's palm, the way her laughter filled every empty space. She told herself this was enough, that the life she was building didn't need his shadow. But some nights after Olivia finally succumbed to sleep and the apartment fell quiet again, Victoria would pause by the window, staring at the streetlight shining through the trees. She would press her hand against the glass and admit in the darkness that no matter how much time passed, a small part of her still wanted him to see what he had left behind. She didn't want his pity or his apologies. She just wanted him to know that what he had abandoned had become something beautiful without him. And then she would turn away and draw the curtains, refusing to let that longing shape her life any longer. The confrontation. It had been almost 4 exact years since Victoria had last seen Ethan, when everything she thought she had buried resurfaced with a single, unexpected encounter. She hadn't planned to be anywhere near the city he called his domain. She hadn't even planned to leave the town that morning. But Olivia had developed a cough that worried her enough to book the first appointment she could get, which happened to be at the children's clinic, directly across from one of the tall glass towers that still bore Ethan's name in silver lettering above the entrance. She told herself it didn't matter. She would be in and out. No one would see her. No ghosts would rise from behind those mirrored windows to remind her of what she had lost. She had bundled Olivia into her warm pink coat, the one with the large buttons she loved to play with. On the bus ride, the little girl fell asleep, nestled on her shoulder, and Victoria closed her eyes, breathing in the soft scent of her hair. For a moment, she felt stable, as if everything she had rebuilt could not be shaken by a place or a memory. When they arrived, she carried Olivia up the clinic steps, smiling as the receptionist complimented her daughter's bright blue eyes. Those eyes were the one feature she could never explain away. Everyone assumed they were from Victoria's side of the family, and she never corrected them. She told herself she owed Olivia the truth one day, but she wasn't ready to give it yet. The appointment was quick, nothing serious, just a lingering cold. They exited the clinic just as the afternoon light turned the glass of the office towers into blades of gold. Victoria should have walked straight to the bus stop, should have kept her head down and never looked back. But as she adjusted Olivia's scarf, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, she lifted her gaze across the plaza, and her breath caught so sharply she thought she might choke. Ethan was standing on the steps of his building, flanked by 2 men in suits who were saying something to him, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on her. She had no idea how long he had been standing there, or how much of her he had already taken in. She tried to look away, but couldn't. The years fell away in an instant, and she was 26 again, standing in her kitchen as he told her he needed a different life. For several heartbeats, they simply stared at each other across the space that had grown between them. His face was older, more lined around the eyes, but the shock in him was unmistakable. She didn't know what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized the woman he had left, or if she was now a stranger to him. A dozen thoughts collided in her mind. She should leave. She should protect herself, protect Olivia. But her legs wouldn't move. Then, slowly, his gaze dropped to the small child standing beside her, holding her hand. Victoria felt the air rush out of her lungs as she realized this was the moment she had both dreaded and secretly longed for. The moment he saw the undeniable proof of everything he had chosen to walk away from. His eyes widened, and his lips parted, as if he were about to shout. But no sound came out. Olivia looked up at her, confused by the sudden tension, and tightened her grip on Victoria's fingers. Victoria swallowed hard. She knew she couldn't let him be the first to speak. She didn't want her daughter's memory of this day to begin with the sound of his voice. So she knelt down and brushed a stray lock of hair from Olivia's cheek, her hand trembling slightly. "Come on, sweetie," she said with the calmest voice she could manage. "It's time to go home." But when she straightened up, Ethan had already crossed half the distance between them. She saw him move with a determination that was at odds with the shock still etched on his features. One of his colleagues called his name, but he didn't turn around. His eyes were fixed on Olivia, then on her, and Victoria felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. He stopped a few feet away, panting as if he had run the entire way. "Victoria," he said, and her name on his lips made something sharp and painful twist in her chest. He looked at her as though he needed her to confirm what he already knew. His voice was unsteady when he spoke again. "Is she—" Victoria lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. She saw a small crowd gathering at the edges of the plaza, people pretending not to look. She didn't care. She had carried this truth alone for too long to be ashamed now. "Her name is Olivia," she said, her voice steady. "And yes, she is your daughter." The last trace of color drained from his face. For a moment, she thought he would collapse. His hand flew up to cover his mouth, and in his eyes, she saw something she never thought she would see in him. Raw, naked regret. The world around them continued to move. Cars, voices, and the lengthening afternoon shadows. But for Victoria, time had stopped. Audience interaction. What will Ethan say now? If you were Victoria, what would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. We're almost at the end of this emotional roller coaster. Don't forget to subscribe for the final meaningful fois. The start of atonement. For a long moment, Ethan stood rooted in front of her, his breathing ragged, as if every word he needed had abandoned him. The polished glass facade behind him reflected the image of the man he had become over the years. Powerful, composed, untouchable. But standing here, with the late afternoon sun caught in Olivia's hair and Victoria's gaze fixed on his, he looked nothing like that figure. He looked like someone whose entire foundation had just cracked. Victoria tried to keep her expression calm, but inside, she felt like she was standing too close to a cliff's edge. Olivia clung to her leg, sensing the weight of the moment, even if she didn't understand it. Victoria rested her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder, forcing herself to breathe evenly, because she wouldn't let him see her afraid. Ethan's hand dropped from his mouth, and he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and unfamiliar. "I didn't know," he said. The words seemed to be extracted from him, like something painful. "Victoria, I swear to you, I didn't know you were pregnant when I walked away." She didn't answer immediately, because she had imagined this conversation too many times. In her mind, she had always been prepared to unleash every bit of anger she had stored up all these years. But now that he was standing there, looking at her not with arrogance, but with something akin to devastation, her voice came out quieter than she expected. "You chose not to know," she said. "You made sure you wouldn't have to." He closed his eyes and let out a shuddering sigh, as if bracing himself for the truth he had avoided. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't want to look too closely because I was terrified of what I would find. I thought if I kept my distance I could move on. But I didn't move on, Victoria. Not for a single day." She looked at him then, truly, and she saw there were lines on his face she hadn't noticed before, small betrayals of time and the way it changes a man, whether he admits it or not. A flicker of cruel satisfaction crossed her mind at the sight that he hadn't been immune to the consequences, but there was no relief in it. It didn't give her back the nights she had spent alone with a feverish baby, or the mornings she woke up wondering how she was going to keep the lights on. She felt her throat tighten, but she refused to look away. "Why now?" she asked. "Why do you come here? Why do you even try to talk to me?" He hesitated, as if searching for an answer that wouldn't sound hollow. "Because I saw her," he said finally, his voice low, and in that moment, I knew I had made the worst mistake of my life. His gaze dropped to Olivia, who was still clinging to her, looking up at him with large, uncertain eyes. "She looks like you," he whispered. "But when she looked at me, it was like seeing myself all over again. And I don't even know her name." The confession broke something in his composure, a small fissure he couldn't completely seal. She swallowed and smoothed Olivia's hair, needing to touch something solid. "You can't expect anything from us," she said. "You walked away. You left me to figure this out alone. I don't care what you regret." Her eyes lifted, and for the first time she saw his, filled with something unguarded and painfully human. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect you to let me in. But please, can I at least speak to her?" Victoria felt her pulse hammer in her throat. Everything in her wanted to say no, to protect the small, safe world she had built around her daughter. But she looked at Olivia and thought of how many times she had asked where her daddy was, why she didn't have one, like the other kids at daycare. And she knew she would have to face this moment sooner or later. It was better it happen on her terms than by accident later. She knelt beside Olivia and met her daughter's confused gaze. "Liv," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "This is someone who knew Mommy a long time ago." Olivia studied him with solemn curiosity. Then she looked at Ethan, her small brow furrowed. Victoria's throat tightened further, but she forced herself to continue. "His name is Ethan," she said. He is your father." The word dropped between them like something too heavy to lift. For an instant, no one spoke. Then Olivia looked back at her with wide eyes. "Daddy?" she said, tasting the word as if it were a foreign language. Victoria closed her eyes and released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. When she looked up again, Ethan had sunk down onto one knee, his face pale and stricken, and there was nothing polished or powerful about him anymore. He just looked like a man who had finally realized the cost of everything he had thrown away. Audience interaction. What do you think Ethan felt in that moment? Do you think Victoria should let him get closer to Olivia? Leave us your opinions in the comments. Click like, and let's see how this journey of redemption unfolds. A new rhythm. Ethan didn't know how long he stayed kneeling on the pavement, but he finally became aware of the crowd starting to stare. He didn't care. For years, he had built his reputation on never letting emotion interfere with his decisions. But standing in front of Victoria and the little girl he didn't know existed, he felt like the man he had been was a stranger to him now. He looked at Olivia, who was watching him with the quiet, serious attention that children sometimes give to things they don't fully understand. Her blue eyes were so much like his, it ached in his chest. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would make this easier, but he had no idea how to talk to a child whose entire early life he had completely missed. Victoria moved closer to her daughter, her hand resting protectively on Olivia's shoulder. There was no longer anger in her expression, just a kind of weary caution that made him feel even smaller. He understood that she was allowing this moment not for him, but for Olivia. That knowledge humbled him more than any business failure. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice, and said the only thing that came to mind. "Hello, Olivia," he managed, his tone soft, unsure. "I'm sorry I wasn't here before." The little girl tilted her head, studying him the way she might study something unfamiliar, but interesting. And he felt his throat tighten with the effort he was making not to cry. Victoria spoke next, her voice calm but firm. "You need to understand that she doesn't know you," she said. "You can't just show up and expect this to make sense to her." He nodded immediately. "I don't expect anything," he said quickly. I couldn't walk away again. I had to at least look her in the eyes and tell her that I know I failed." His gaze dropped to the sidewalk. "And that I'm sorry." A silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things neither of them could dare to say. Olivia shifted her weight from one foot to the other, then reached for her mother's hand. Victoria lowered her gaze and gave her a reassuring squeeze before meeting Ethan's eyes again. "We were about to head home," she said. There was no invitation in her tone, but there was no final dismissal either. He understood that this was the most she could offer, and it was more than he deserved. He nodded again, feeling unsteady. "I can walk you to the bus stop," he said, his voice low. "If that's okay." Victoria hesitated, and for a moment he was sure she would refuse. But after a long pause, she gave a slight nod. She turned to Olivia and brushed her hair back from her forehead. "We'll take the bus home, sweetheart," she murmured. Olivia looked between them with curious eyes, but didn't protest. Victoria hiked her purse strap higher on her shoulder and began walking toward the corner. Ethan stayed a few steps behind them, afraid to get too close. They moved slowly down the pavement as the shadows lengthened, and Ethan realized he was memorizing every detail. The way Olivia hopped over cracks in the sidewalk, the way Victoria kept glancing back to make sure he hadn't disappeared. He wanted to tell her he wasn't going to leave again, but he knew words meant nothing without proof. He thought of all the birthdays and bedtime stories he had missed, all the nights Victoria had spent alone, and he wondered how he had ever convinced himself that success was worth more than this. When they reached the bus stop, Victoria turned to face him. Her expression was guarded, composed, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You can't expect her to understand what you are to her yet," she said. "I won't let you confuse her or make promises you don't keep." He felt the weight of her gaze and nodded. "I don't ask you to trust me," he said. "I only ask for the chance to be here, to do this the right way, even if it's too late." A horn sounded as the bus pulled up, and Olivia turned, her small face lighting up at the familiar sound. Victoria took her hand and guided her toward the open doors. Before stepping on, she looked back at him one last time. Her voice was very soft when she spoke. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said. He swallowed, feeling something release painfully in his chest. "I know," he said simply, and then she turned, leading Olivia up the bus steps. As the doors closed, Olivia pressed her hand against the window, her tiny palm tentative against the glass. Ethan raised his own hand in response, and for a fleeting moment, his blue eyes met hers. As the bus pulled away, he stood there long after it had vanished, feeling that he was finally beginning to understand everything he had lost and everything he still hoped to find. A new choice. Ethan returned to that same bus stop the next day because he didn't know what else to do. He told himself he had meetings, calls, a life that still needed his attention. But none of it felt real. All he could think about was the way Olivia had looked at him through the glass, her hand pressed against the window as if unsure whether to wave or not. He spent the night in a hotel only a few blocks from where Victoria lived, staring at the ceiling as the dawn crept slowly across the unfamiliar walls. Every passing hour made it clearer that he couldn't pretend his life made sense without trying to mend his mistakes. As desperate as it felt, when the first morning light touched the treetops, he walked through the neighborhood for over an hour before finally gathering the courage to approach their building. It was small, older than he expected, with peeling paint on the trim and a narrow flight of stairs leading to the door. He tried not to imagine Victoria climbing those stairs with groceries while Olivia tugged at her sleeve. He had never worried much about how she lived, too certain that if she needed anything, she would have asked for it. Now he realized she had never trusted him enough to believe he would help. He waited on the sidewalk, unsure if knocking on the door unannounced was the right thing to do. He wanted to respect her boundaries, but he also couldn't bear the thought that if he left now, she would think he had changed his mind again. He was still standing there when the door finally opened. Victoria appeared first, dressed simply in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled up. She looked tired, but when her eyes met his, they were clear and steady. Olivia followed a moment later, clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The street around them began to fill with the sounds of morning, the clatter of delivery trucks, a dog barking in a nearby yard, the laughter of children farther down the street. Everything felt strangely muffled, as if he were viewing it from behind thick glass. Finally, Victoria lifted her chin, her voice calm. "You can walk with us to school if you want," she said. And though her words were simple, he felt them settle in his chest like something fragile that he didn't dare touch too quickly. He nodded, falling into step beside her as they started down the cracked pavement. Olivia said nothing at first, keeping her eyes on her shoes, her small hand tightly wrapped around her mother's. He didn't press her to look at him. He just watched her and tried to memorize the way the top of her hair parted perfectly over the curve of her head, how the edge of her pink coat brushed her knees as she walked. He had missed every tiny detail, and he knew he could never get that time back. Victoria didn't try to fill the silence, and he was grateful for it. They reached the corner where the school gate stood open, children streaming in with bright backpacks. Olivia finally looked up at him, her expression cautious but curious. He crouched down so he could look her in the eye without towering over her. "Hello again," he said softly, and to his surprise, she didn't flinch. She studied his face as if trying to decide what to make of him. Then, she shifted her weight and turned her face into her mother's hip, hiding. He felt something sharp twist behind his ribs, but he didn't let it show. He knew this was what he deserved. Victoria touched Olivia's hair, smoothing it, and then looked at him. "She's shy with people she doesn't know well," she said. "You can't expect her to be comfortable right away." He nodded quickly. "I don't expect to be," he said. "I'll wait as long as it takes." He stood up again and stepped back, giving them space. Victoria's gaze held his for another moment, searching, measuring, and then she nodded once. "We'll be back here at 3, she said. "If you want to come then." He swallowed, unable to speak. He just nodded, and she turned to guide Olivia inside. He watched them walk through the gates until they disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. He tried to focus on his work calls in the hotel lobby, but every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was Olivia's small face, turning away shyly. At 5 minutes to 3, he was waiting on the corner. When they reappeared, Olivia was clutching a piece of construction paper painted with bright yellow flowers. She spoke softly to Victoria, her free hand gesturing as she described something important. She didn't notice him until they were almost beside him. When she did, she stopped, wide-eyed, and looked up at her mother. Victoria waited, giving her the chance to decide for herself. Slowly, Olivia approached him, holding up her artwork for him to see. He crouched down again, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear. "Those are flowers," he said, and for once his voice didn't shake. "You're a very good artist." She studied him for another moment, then nodded solemnly, as if she had decided something important. Without a word, she reached out and handed him the paper. It was the smallest gesture, but it felt like the beginning of everything he thought he had lost forever. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Ethan had never known. Every morning he woke with the same nervous ache in his chest, unsure if Victoria would permit him to walk with them, or if Olivia would even look his way. He never assumed he was welcome, but he showed up anyway, standing at the end of the sidewalk until Victoria raised her hand in a cautious acknowledgement. He learned to walk beside them, never reaching for Olivia, letting her decide when she felt safe enough to be near. He watched her become a little bolder each day, first glancing at him, then asking shy questions, and finally offering her drawings, as if they were tokens of a cautious trust. One afternoon, leaving school, Olivia surprised him by sliding her small hand into his without looking up. Her palm was warm and soft, and he held it gently, terrified he might somehow scare her away by holding on too tightly. Victoria noticed, but didn't comment. She just watched them with an expression he couldn't decipher. For the rest of the walk home, Olivia chattered about a book she had read, pausing every now and then to make sure he was listening. He answered every question, even the smallest ones, feeling something unravel in his chest that he hadn't known was there. It was a kind of quiet peace he had never found in boardrooms or penthouses, or in the long hours chasing the respect of people he didn't even like. That evening, Victoria invited him in for tea. It was the first time he had crossed the threshold of her apartment. He carefully took off his shoes and stood in the narrow entryway, observing the walls hung with Olivia's drawings and the small kitchen where Victoria moved, like someone who had built a life out of necessity rather than choice. She poured the tea and placed 2 cups on the tiny table, then sat across from him, not meeting his eyes. For a time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was Olivia, humming softly in the next room. Finally, Victoria took a deep, steadying breath. "I don't know what you expect from me." Her voice was low, but even. "I'm not ready to pretend the past didn't happen." "I don't expect you to be," he said immediately, for he had rehearsed this in his head 100 times. "I don't want you to forgive me if you can't. I just want to be here, to know her, to help." She looked up then, and her eyes were tired, but not malicious. "You can't fix what you broke by showing up for a few weeks," she said. "She doesn't understand why you were gone." "One day she will," he whispered, "and when that day comes, I will tell her the truth, that I was a coward, and that it was my fault, not yours." Her gaze held his for a long time, searching for any sign that he was lying. Finally, she nodded, as if she had decided to believe a small part of him. "I don't make you any promises," she said quietly. "I don't ask for any," he replied. After a moment, Olivia wandered in with her stuffed rabbit, climbing onto Victoria's lap. She looked at him, her blue eyes solemn, and he realized she was waiting for something. He opened his arms slightly, unsure if she would understand the invitation. To his astonishment, she slid off Victoria's lap and crossed the small space to climb onto his. Her head settled against his shoulder, and he stayed very still, as if any sudden movement would break the spell. Victoria didn't say anything, but her eyes were shining. For the first time since that afternoon in the plaza, it didn't look like she was bracing herself for disappointment. She looked almost at peace. Later, when it was time for him to leave, he gently lowered Olivia. She reached for her mother's hand, but she turned back to him with a small, sleepy smile. He felt something in his chest clench, then release, as if it was finally safe to breathe. At the door, Victoria met his gaze one last time. "You can come tomorrow," she said. Her voice was soft. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Stepping out into the cool night air, he felt a kind of calm certainty he hadn't known in years. He knew he still had everything to prove, that trust would take time, that forgiveness might never come. But he also knew that, for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. This ending is powerful because it doesn't pretend that love or regret alone can erase years of absence. What makes it satisfying is how honest it is about the consequences of Ethan's choices. He doesn't get an instant reunion or unconditional forgiveness. He gets the opportunity to prove, day by day, that he can be better. The fact that Victoria is cautious but hopeful is important. She doesn't let him back into her life because she's still in love with the man he was. She lets him in because she sees he is finally taking responsibility. The story also respects Olivia's perspective. She is too young to understand everything, but her slow, hesitant acceptance shows that children are often more open-hearted than adults, provided they feel safe. The fact that he commits to showing up, not to promising, is the most moving part. The idea that redemption comes not from an apology, but from the choice to keep showing up, no matter how hard it is. We hope this story has moved you. What do you think of Ethan's emotional journey? Do you think he will manage to win Victoria and Olivia's trust? Tell us your opinion in the comments. Click like if you want to see a sequel to this story. The stakes are higher. Ethan had mastered the art of the deal. But the trust of a child and the heart of the woman he left? Those were stakes he couldn't put a price on. Hit subscribe now and leave a comment telling us, what real-life challenge do you think Ethan needs to overcome next? Learning the language of home. The tentative peace that settled between Ethan and Victoria over the next few weeks was fragile, built on the small, consistent acts of showing up. Ethan rented a small apartment a few blocks from Victoria's building, trading his penthouse view for the sound of children playing in the nearby park. He didn't tell his colleagues where he was, only that he was managing a critical, long-term acquisition off-site, a lie that felt ironically truthful. He went to work, but his focus was fundamentally altered. He now measured his time not in stock market hours, but in the distance between school drop-off and pickup. He learned the language of home, the right way to cut Olivia's toast, small triangles, never squares, the exact spot on the sidewalk where she liked to jump over the crack, and the specific way she held his hand, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, as if anchoring herself to his presence. One chilly Tuesday, as they walked home from school, Olivia was skipping and suddenly stopped. "Daddy, why do you wear a tie every day?" she asked, her blue eyes wide as she looked up at his impeccable dark suit. She used the word daddy naturally now, a small victory that still made his throat catch every time. Ethan, caught off guard, stumbled over his reply. "Well, sweetie, I wear a tie because I have a very important job. It's part of the uniform for making big deals." Olivia frowned, looking at her brightly colored mittens. "Is it more important than playing blocks?" The question hit him with the force of a 1,000-point drop on the index fund. He knelt down immediately, ignoring the rough scrape of his expensive trousers on the pavement. "No, Liv," he said, his voice earnest. "No job is more important than playing blocks. It just feels like it sometimes. But you're showing me what's really important." Olivia nodded, satisfied. She took his hand and continued skipping, leaving Ethan kneeling there, realizing that for 20 years he had been wearing the wrong uniform. Victoria, who had been listening silently, walked over and offered him a hand up. "That was honest," she whispered, her eyes softening. "Honesty is a good place to start rebuilding." "I have to be," he admitted. "She sees right through the veneer, just like you always did." He knew the financial differences between their two lives were still a chasm. Victoria insisted on paying for everything for Olivia, refusing his offers of money, though he knew she was still working long, tiring hours cleaning offices at night. He respected her independence, but he desperately wanted to ease her burden. "I need to ask you something, Victoria," he said later that evening, as they sat over lukewarm tea, the silence less strained than before. "I want to set up an educational fund for Olivia, a trust, completely in her name, managed by a neutral third party. I won't touch it, and neither will you. It's not about paying you back. It's about securing her future, so you don't have to work 3 jobs to give her what she deserves." Victoria looked at him, her gaze penetrating. She knew he was using corporate strategy to bypass her pride, but she couldn't deny the logic. "I won't let you use this as leverage," she warned. "I've spent my life on leverage," he replied with a faint, self-deprecating smile. "I'm done with it. I promise, no strings attached, just a father taking responsibility." After a moment that stretched taut, she sighed and nodded. "All right, Ethan, for Olivia, but I choose the third party." It was another small win, a brick removed from the wall, but it was earned through genuine intent, not manipulation. A new crisis, and a true test. The next real test came a week later, not from the past, but from the present. Ethan was on his way to meet Victoria for the school run when his phone buzzed relentlessly. His most trusted deputy was calling from San Francisco. Urgent, bordering on panic. "Mr. Kincaid, we have a crisis." His deputy's voice crackled. "The board is split on the Kingsley merger. Our key shareholder, Mr. Thorne, is threatening to sell off his position. We need you on a plane to Tokyo tonight for an emergency vote. You have to be here to stabilize this." This was it. The ultimate siren call of his old life. A high-stakes, multi-million-dollar emergency that only he could solve. His instinct, honed over 2 decades, screamed at him to rush to the airport, reclaim control, and secure the deal. He looked at the small, narrow street where Victoria and Olivia would emerge in 10 minutes. He took a deep breath, and his reply was instant, surprising even himself. "Cancel my flight, James," Ethan said, his voice calm and firm. "Delegate the authority to the head of acquisitions. Advise Mr. Thorne that I am tied up with a non-negotiable personal obligation. If he chooses to sell, he sells. This deal, and the firm, will survive without me." A moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. "But sir, your reputation." "My reputation will now be built on my choices, not my net worth," Ethan cut in. "Handle it. And don't call me again unless the building is on fire. My priority is elsewhere." He hung up the phone and slipped it into his pocket, his hand shaking slightly. Not from the adrenaline of the deal, but from the realization of the massive, life-altering choice he had just made. He had put Olivia ahead of his empire. He had chosen the walk home over the flight to Tokyo. He was still standing there when Victoria and Olivia walked out. "Hi, Daddy!" Olivia shouted, running up to him with a gap-toothed smile and a picture of a very wobbly giraffe. Victoria approached more slowly, her eyes guarded. "You look preoccupied. Did something happen at the office?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He took the drawing from Olivia, praising the giraffe's long, majestic neck. Then, he looked at Victoria, his cool blue eyes warmer than she had ever seen them. "The firm had a crisis," he said simply. "A major vote I was expected to fly out for tonight." Victoria's expression tightened. "And you didn't go?" "No," Ethan confirmed. "I chose to be here. This is the only critical long-term acquisition that matters to me now." He held up the drawing. "The giraffe needs to be safely transported home." Victoria searched his face for any sign of a lie, but all she saw was a weary kind of peace. She didn't offer praise or forgiveness. She just gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. But in that moment, it felt like a greater validation than any board approval he had ever received. Audience interaction. Ethan sacrificed a major business deal for his family. Do you think he will regret this decision later? Or was this the ultimate turning point he needed? Let us know your opinions in the comments. Don't forget to like and share this video. The unspoken promise. The small moments of truth continued to chip away at the fortress that separated them. Ethan spent that evening sitting on the floor of Victoria's tiny living room, attempting to read a bedtime story about a lonely space captain to Olivia. His voice was too formal, too clipped for the whimsical tale. But Olivia didn't seem to mind. She just curled into his lap, occasionally correcting his pronunciation of the alien characters. When Olivia finally slept, tucked under her brightly colored quilt, Ethan and Victoria sat in the kitchen, drinking the lukewarm tea that had become their nightly ritual. "I need to know your plan," Victoria said, breaking the silence. "The firm is used to you being unavailable, but you can't live in a hotel block away forever. What do you see for our future, Ethan?" He looked at her, his expression serious. "I see a future where I don't need a tie to feel worthy. I've started the process of stepping back from day-to-day operations. I'm restructuring my life, Victoria, not just my company. I want to build a house here, a real home, close to the school, with a yard big enough for a wobbly giraffe and a space captain. And I want to do it with you." "A house?" she repeated, a hint of skepticism in her voice. "That sounds like a grand gesture. You know I can't just move in with you because you decide to buy me a house." I know, he agreed. But I also know that you deserve a place that isn't falling apart. I want to build a place where Olivia grows up knowing stability. I want you to design it, Victoria. Every single corner. You choose the location, the size, the layout. I'll simply fund it. You don't have to live there with me. But I hope that one day you might consider it. I'm not asking you to marry me again. I'm asking you to be my partner in this one, final critical project, raising our daughter together. Victoria studied him, seeing past the weary lines and the expensive suit. She saw the man who had finally let go of his fear, the man who was willing to build a foundation that was truly rooted in love and commitment. She took a slow, deep breath, and a ghost of her old tender smile appeared on her face. "Ethan Kincaid," she murmured. "You always were an intense man when you decided to take on a project." "This is the most important project of my life," he confessed. She didn't give him an answer that night. But when he stood at the door, she did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his cheek, a fleeting, gentle touch that spoke of years of buried affection. "Tomorrow you can come with us to the park," she said softly. "But bring casual clothes and no tie. Olivia says the trees don't care about important jobs." Ethan nodded, a lump forming in his throat. Noted. As he walked away that night, he knew the road to full trust and reconciliation was long, but it was a road he was finally walking, not running from. He had exchanged a life of calculated gain for a life of profound purpose. He had found his true north, and it was in the laughter of a small girl with his eyes, and the cautious hope of the woman he had abandoned. He had once believed that success could compensate for loneliness. He now knew, with absolute certainty, that only love could heal the deepest wounds. What do you think of Victoria's decision to invite Ethan to the park? Is she opening the door to a second chance? Comment below. If you loved this redemption story, please like and share. Thank you for watching.